So let's talk about what's happening around Kremenchuk. I mean, they say it was an arms depot. Obviously, there was a shopping centre that was damaged. What kind of message are we drawing from this attack here?
Well, what other Russians say, we have to take with a pinch of salt all the time. We've got to try and analyse what we see. Face value, a brutal attack, carnage wreaked on the ground. And actually, it wasn't just there. There have been attacks all over the country. The real question here is why? Was it to send a message to the G7? Was it a message to try to send a message to President Zelensky or the wider world? Or actually, was it genuinely military targets? Putin has to be concerned at the flow of weapons coming in from the West, because some of the modern weapons have the real potential of turning the tide of this battle. So there's no doubt that Putin will be trying to target those lines of communication, rail hubs, etc., and also ammunition factories. And whilst he claims that the ammunition factory was nearby this target in the supermarket, the reality is he missed the target. And it does appear that the Russians are missing more targets than they're hitting at the moment. The concern is the law of armed conflict, which goes back 4,000 years, means that every reasonable attempt should be made to avoid civilian casualties and infrastructure. Back 100 years ago, this sort of attack might have been just considered collateral damage. We're used to precision weapons. In the 21st century, this appears to be entirely avoidable.
Yeah, and obviously, we've got, coming later, the opening of that NATO conference in Madrid. I mean, what are we taking from the fact that NATO have massively increased the troops at a ready deployment in the coming weeks?
Yeah, part of the irony here is that you wind the clock back a few weeks. NATO was trying desperately not to get involved into the conflict itself. Now we're seeing NATO stepping up efforts to increase its numbers, etc. The challenge here is Putin's attack purely tactical? Take the Donbass, land bridge, Crimea, war's over shortly. Or his language starts talking about Peter the Great. He starts talking about some of the former Warsaw Pact countries actually being part of the family of Russia, and clearly an expansionist agenda to restore Russian greatness. The challenge with that is if we look at the former Baltic states, Lithuania, Latvia and Estonia, they're now part of NATO. Yeah. And therefore, NATO has to be prepared. It can't wait for the attack to happen. And that's why we're seeing 40,000 high readiness troops now becoming 300,000 high readiness troops just in preparation for the worst.
And we can see that Russian exclave there, Kaliningrad, surrounded by those NATO countries. Now, let's speak a little bit about what we heard from the new head of the British Army, General Sir Patrick Sanders, talking about 1937. Just give us a little history lesson as to what he's talking about in 1937.
Yeah, well, 1937, of course, we were less than 2 decades after the end of the First World War. And the Nazi forces had just entered the Rhineland, but Hitler had said, I've got no ambitions beyond this anywhere in Europe. At the time, the Prime Minister, Neville Chamberlain, and the British public had no appetite for war whatsoever. They'd recovered from World War I, no appetite for war. And therefore, the leadership was trying to appease Hitler at the time. 2 years later, of course, we were dragged into a war which we were singularly unprepared for, and it took a couple of years before we were able to get ourselves properly prepared and then liberate Europe. Why are there analogies to today? Well, there are several nations, particularly in Europe, who have a challenge between domestic politics and international. The high fuel prices, the high inflation prices, many of them would like to see this war in Ukraine end, come to some sort of conclusion quickly and appease Putin. The problem is this is Putin's war, he's the guy, and if we're going to avoid history repeating itself, the West has to be prepared and have a credible deterrent. And that's why you're seeing a lot of the forces, a lot of the rhetoric about 1937, the decision point, best to plan for the worst and hope for the best.